good to be back doing podcasting. Hope everybody's doing great. I've been gone for about a month, but I haven't been loafing. I've been working. I'm so glad you guys have hung with me. I really appreciate you. I also appreciate all the emails and texts and Facebook messages asking how I am. I answered a few. So enough of that. I'm back. I got a little bit more to go starting next week, about a 2-week crunch. Then I should be free for the rest of the summer to podcast at least 2 or 3 every week. Let's get rolling with this video. I've got 5 stories, 2 from Australia. Think you're going to like it. I do. All right, here we go. Here's an email from Running Wolf, and I really enjoyed reading this. It's short, but I think you'll like it. He writes, "This is a short, true story and probably not as interesting as most, but here it goes. My niece came home and told my sister that she thought she had seen a Bigfoot in the Houston National Forest. They live in a small town called Cut and Shoot on Highway 105 between Cleveland and Conroe, which borders the Houston National Forest and the Big Thicket. The Big Thicket is called that because it's a merger of the southern pine forests, the Gulf coastal plains, and the Louisiana swamps. They come together to create a jungle-type environment. It was said in my youth that you couldn't go into the thicket for more than 100 yards before you would step on a water moccasin. With the expansion of civilization and the encroachment of urban-style neighborhoods, I would dare say that now you can venture as far as 200 yards before stepping on a water moccasin. Oh, that's a great improvement, Running Wolf. At any rate, my sister told my niece that she probably saw a deer. My niece replied that it was big and brown and it was walking on 2 legs. My sister has always had a crush on Bobo Fay from the TV show Finding Bigfoot, so she immediately started thinking that if they found some tracks, they might be on the Bigfoot show with Bobo Fay. My sister grabbed her small gun, a double-barrel 12-gauge shotgun, loaded with double-aught buckshot, and said, "Let's go." My niece said, "Mama, don't you think it's going to be dangerous for the 2 of us?" My sister replied, "Yes, but maybe the Sasquatch will survive anyway." There you go. They returned to the area where my niece saw the Bigfoot. No tracks were found because the thick layer of pine straw covering the ground. But they did find fresh limbs broken off about 8 feet high, and they were all pointing in the same direction. My sister made this observation and said, I think that this creature is pointing out a direction for others of his kind to follow him." It was late November of 2020, and here's the interesting part of the story. The following day, on the very front page of the Cold Springs Gazette was the story titled "Bigfoot Spotted on San Jacinto and Liberty County Lines." My sister told my niece he must have traveled fast because when we were looking for him in the Sam Houston Forest, he was already east of us. All hopes of being on the Bobo Fay show were diminishing rapidly, but my sister was convinced that my niece saw a Bigfoot. And this is my story submitted by Running Wolf. Well, I would say, Running Wolf, your niece had great aspirations. She was really ready to get on that show and talk about the Bigfoot that she saw, and I'm sad that didn't work out, but I'm sure they had fun anyway. It sounds like both of the women have a great sense of humor and are high-spirited and really aren't afraid of anything. But I thought it was an interesting story, and I wanted to share it with you guys. Running Wolf, thanks for writing it, man. It was really nice. Thanks. Y'all ever heard the phrase TMI, too much information? Here's a little TMI for you. I don't use deodorant anymore. You know why? Because I use Yeti bar soap. Yeti bar soap smells so good and it sticks to me all day, sometimes till the next day. My wife can't believe it. She says, buy more, keep using that soap. I'm wondering if she thinks I stink or something. But not anymore with Yeti bars. Yeti Bars is a soap company They have several scents. They use all natural ingredients. They even offer moisturizers now. I think they even named a bar after me. They call it the Dixiecryptid bar. It's a patchouli scented soap. I love that soap. They also offer really cool Yeti gear. Use discount code DC10 at checkout and get 10% off your purchase. Check them out at YetiBars.net, YetiBars.net, or Yeti Bars on Facebook. I've not seen a bad review on this company, not one. YetiBars.net. Give them a look. Okay, here's one of the emails from Australia. The writer's name is Sam. He's an Aboriginal man from Australia. I don't know anything about the Aboriginals, the original people who were there when the English sent all their prisoners to Australia and that country began to evolve culturally. But if Crocodile Dundee and Quigley Down Under are any kind of representation of how these people are, they're just super, super nice, easygoing, polite, peaceful people. I love this story, so I hope you guys enjoy it. He writes, "G'day, Dixie. My name is Sam, and I'm from a somewhat rural town in far north Queensland, Australia, called Ingham. Our main export is sugarcane, but behind the sugarcane is a lot of bloody big mountains. They're covered in thick scrub and loaded with caves and cliffs. I'd say those mountains are perfect for something to hide away from civilization. Past the mountains are miles upon miles of scrub leading directly into Australia's sandy heart. This story is an encounter with a Yowie, or hairy man, which is what Aboriginals call Bigfoot in Australia. It isn't my first-hand encounter, but one my uncle had. He's an Australian Aboriginal like me who works at a national park as a ranger. I guess they're similar to your national park rangers, but they're more hands-on. For example, they do backburning during the winter before we turn into the devil's anus." That's a hot place. If you aren't aware of what backburning is, it's a way of preventing disastrous bushfires from ravaging the bush. It was first performed by the Aboriginals before settlement as a way of hunting as well as keeping the bush from harm. Coincidentally, this event happened after my uncle was finishing up from backburning late at night around 11 p.m. My uncle was at one of the ranger bases up in the mountains surrounding the valley where Ingham is located. He was taking off his fire suit and packing up all his gear when he began to hear a chattering up on the ridge that overlooked him. He said he could also hear children talking and other faint noises. He was already getting scared and was beginning to wish his workmates hadn't left him behind earlier when he heard a crashing sound like someone was running right at him. He stiffened and braced himself, not knowing what to expect, but it stopped about 10 feet in front of him just beyond his line of vision. He quickly aimed his headlight in that direction and flipped it on. Just 10 feet in front of him, slightly raised on the slope of a ridge resting on a tree, was a Yowie looking right at him. In panic, he bloody-legged back into the ranger base, praying that his workmates would come back and pick him up soon. It was only about 10 minutes later when he saw the headlights of the patrol vehicle creeping its way up to his position, but it was the scariest 10 minutes of his life. That's pretty much the end of the story, but I'd like to add that his grandfather was involved in the ancient Aboriginal spirituality and had multiple encounters with the hairy man. Thanks for reading this, mate. I love your channel. Love from Australia. Sam, love from the United States, brother. Man, what a cool story. And these short stories, I've said it a million times, are just as impactful as the long, drawn-out stories, which are also interesting. But I mean, it's a secondhand story from a man who's from a whole nother age. And apparently this hairy man or Yowie myth or story that is in Australia is just as prevalent way back then as the Bigfoot stories are here in North America. But I love this story, and I could just see it all happening in my mind as I read it. And I don't know, I just love my Australian friends, and I really appreciate them sending these. I have another Australian story from Australia coming up in a minute. They just happen to coincide one right after another in the lineup here, and I'm so glad I got them. So let's move on to another story. Thanks, Sam, for the story, buddy. I appreciate you. Now, here's an email I've had for a long time from a friend of mine. Her name is Lanita, and I know Lanita. She lives in Alabama, and I've actually met her. I've been to the Talladega National Forest, and she actually fed me. She showed me around her place. She lives on a beautiful place in the Talladega National Forest, and I just love her to death. I don't know how this story slipped through my fingers and got shuffled in the bag, but here it is, Lanita. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get to it. I have a lot to do, but here it is, and I just wanted to tell her I love her. She's just one of the sweetest people. She was so good to me that weekend we were there in Talladega. But here's what she writes. My encounter began in 1994, just after my divorce. I knew of a 75-acre parcel of land with a log house and a log barn, so I jumped at the chance to live there. I rented the house and I moved in. It had been empty for so long that it took me 3 weeks to clean it. There were snake skins in all the bushes around the house, and several in the basement. I'm not afraid of animals or snakes, so I was fine living among them. You're braver than I am, Lanita. After I had my cabin all taken care of, I began to explore the area. I was surrounded by the beauty of the Talladega National Forest. The driveway was a quarter mile from the house to the barn, and another quarter mile past the barn to the lake. I traveled that little road every day to fish. There were 3 places where my dog Cody loved to wade into the water. Not long after I moved in, my mom was spending the night. The house was built in 1921 and had a small, deep window which I opened to the night air. We were chatting in the living room when something out one of the windows caught my eye. Something ran across my yard and squatted behind my truck. A large light on a pole outside the house lit the yard well enough to clearly see someone running. I gasped, and Mom asked what I had seen. They were tall, medium-built, and black from head to toe, I told my mom. I quickly grabbed my dad's old shotgun, with no bullets in it, by the way, and flew out the door. I yelled into the night for them to step out. No one answered, so I ran to the truck. No one was there. There was nowhere to run except thick woods and undergrowth. I was perplexed, and I returned to the cabin. Late into the night, I heard loud tree breaks and walking through the tangled undergrowth. Living out in the country comes with its own set of sounds. Every night around 7:30, the coyotes would come through the woods yelping as they hunted for food. The frogs and the crickets serenaded me to sleep every night. The longer I lived in the cabin, the more sounds I heard. Around 3 a.m., I would hear something coming down the side of the mountain through the woods, making grunting sounds and chattering. There was more than one animal because one would stand by my house while the other one, in the blink of an eye, would go to the barn and give a yell to the one beside me. I guess it was the all clear signal, and I became used to the creatures. I knew they must be living in my barn. Sometimes while fishing, time would get away from me and I would have to come home past them in the dark. I would usually sing along the way and on occasion play my harmonica as I walked to the lake. I lived there for 2.5 years. My refrigerator went out and I bought a new one. The delivery man asked me out and we started dating. One night while he sat out on the porch, the Bigfoot came down the mountain yelling at each other. It scared him so bad that he ran in the house and whispered, "What was that?" "That's my 2 Bigfoot," I replied as calmly as I could. "I'm leaving," he cried, but then he asked, "How will I get past them to get to my truck?" "I'll walk you out," I told him. "You'll be okay." He wasn't so sure, but he followed me out to his vehicle. He tore out of there as fast as he could, leaving me standing in the driveway laughing. Eventually, he got used to the sounds that they made. We would sit on the porch and listen to them. I married the delivery man, and we moved away. I still go back to visit my black-haired friends. I whoop when I get to the barn and leave a basket of goodies. They like apples and candy, especially cookies. They seem to have a sweet tooth. I saw one in the woods on one of those visits. I quickly snapped a picture of him. I walked within 2 feet of him and he never moved. Surely he knew that I saw him. They have black hair about 3 inches long and smooth and shiny as though it's been brushed. The cabin hasn't been lived in since I moved away. It's in Calhoun County, Alabama, beside the Talladega National Forest, and the land is privately owned. Oh, and by the way, those snakes, my boyfriend and I saw one as big as a python. It lived under our house. Our closest neighbor was a veterinarian who, upon seeing the large holes under the house, informed me that they were rattlesnakes. Yes, Bigfoot live in Alabama, and I too am a knower. It was the happiest time of my life. Come visit, and I'll take you to the cabin. Well, I already did come visit, and she did take me to the cabin, and I love visiting with her. And Lanita, again, I'm sorry it took so long to get to your story, and I think I've got more encounters from you, and I'm going to get to those soon. But thank you for writing this. It was wonderful, and I don't know about you and this delivery guy. I don't know how I would have reacted if I was a woman, if he would have run off and left me by myself with a Bigfoot in the yard. But I guess there was more to the story. And as far as I know, the way Lanita talked about him, she just loves him to death and they're happy as they can be. And it's just a funny story. But anyway, I'll stop rambling on here. Thanks, Lanita, for the story. It was great. Thank you. All right, here's a story from Logan. This is pretty good. He says, to begin with, I'm not the best writer, so I'm sorry if I mess things up. That's okay, Logan. We got somebody checking your writing now, and it looks real good now. My friend Neoma Finn is giving me a lot of help editing these stories. So now that I'm back doing videos, I can do more. I don't have to spend so much time editing these. And she's a wonderful editor, by the way. But enough of that. Also, I have 2 stories. The first one is my dad's. I'm going to tell it to you exactly like he told me from his perspective. I was hunting for spike bull elk with 2 other friends in eastern Washington on a somewhat foggy morning. We were heading towards where we heard an elk bugle. Even if it wasn't a spike elk, we just wanted to see it. There were about 4 of these little dips that we had to go through that stretched about 100 to 150 yards. As we were doing so, one of my friends got ahead of us about 20 yards. He got to the top of the last hill and he stopped. This was a heavily forested area with some very old trees along with some younger ones. And it was foggy, so we didn't have the best view. We often used hand signs to communicate to keep from spooking the animals and giving ourselves away. My friend signaled for us to stop. We froze about 15 to 20 yards behind where he was at the top, and I was closest to him, and after a minute, I slowly walked up to where he was looking into the forest. I could see that he was shaking. I couldn't see any elk in front of him, but there was something there. There was a pile of animal poop that was almost up to my knee, and I'm not a small man. I'm 6'5", 230 pounds. This poop looked somewhat human, just a lot bigger and more than I have ever seen. The thing is it was steaming and it was fresh. It was a relatively cold morning, only about 20 or 30 degrees out. I've tried to talk to my friend about what he saw, but he won't talk to me or anyone else about it. We tried to take him on another hunting trip a few years later, but he wouldn't go. He just stayed at our trucks and built a massive bonfire. Plus, he was yelling so loud that it wasn't even worth hunting. That's the story my dad told me and my cousins. I don't talk to the guy that saw whatever it was. He mostly just stays silent. The closest I ever got to a conversation with him was when he told me to stay out of the woods and that there are things out there that many people don't believe exist, but they actually do. I have recently started hunting. Specifically, I'm hunting around that area in eastern Washington. Not just because of what happened there, but it's a very nice area with a lot of elk and a feeding station for elk. That's why I think it's possible for them to be there. Thousands of elk come down to this feeding station. There's even a trail on the side of one of the mountains that is so old and so beaten down from all the animals that come down, if not to the feeding station, then to the lakes and as predators of the animals that come to the feeding stations as well. My second story is short and happened to me and my dad last hunting season. We were going on a 4-day trip. The first day we were going to just go scouting on our mountain bikes. The place we were going to go can't be reached by a vehicle. A bike or a quad or a dirt bike are the best options. We saw 3 doe elk the entire time we were up there, and that was on the first day. They didn't see us at first, but when they did, they turned and booked away from us more spooked than I've ever seen. I really don't know what runs around up there, but it must be big and it must scare elk to death. I hope you can use these stories. Well, that's interesting, Logan. It's another secondhand story from your dad. It's very interesting. I cannot imagine a pile of poop up to my knee. And you know, animal poop is one thing, but human poop is just nasty. And to be standing next to a pile of something that resembles human poop up to your knee, that's almost like a dinosaur poop. So I'm kind of curious. I'd love to ask your dad some questions about that. It's a pretty interesting story, but Logan, at any rate, I really appreciate you sending it. Thank you, buddy. Okay, this last story is another story from Australia, and it's really good. The writer wants to be anonymous, and that's not a problem. Here's what he writes. Oh, by the way, I'm probably going to mispronounce some of the places and names in this story, so you guys, come on, just take it easy on me. When I was 17, I came home from school one day to find my mother anxiously waiting for me. I've always been a laid-back guy, so when she told me that she and my dad had decided to take a break for a while, I took it pretty well. In fact, it was me who ended up comforting her. For the next couple of days, it seemed a bit weird. Dad wasn't around much even when we were together. He was an interstate truck driver. We were lucky if we saw him for a couple of hours 1 or 2 nights a week before he was off again. So his absence wasn't really unusual. That's why seeing his truck on a Monday when he was never home was such a surprise. I walked out the front as he was swinging the door open, and out jumped a huge black puppy. It was a Mastiff Dane cross that I named Thor. My dad knew I'd wanted a dog for ages. I'd been shooting since I could hold a gun, but I never hunted with dogs. With Thor, I was going to get my chance to contribute to the pig chasing stories at school. Over the next 4 years, Thor grew to be very protective of me. At a whopping 196 pounds, that was a lot of protection. He did have a few anger issues. No one could pet him, and he wouldn't eat unless I gave him the food. He scared my mother a lot, too. She'd always say, "We need to get rid of that dog. He's going to bite someone." I always shrugged it off. One weekend, a mate I went to school with rang me and said that we were going pigging. He said to get my stuff together and he'd be at my place in an hour. I went and got Thor's pigging collar, a drink bottle, and my long-range rifle. About 9 a.m., my mate turned up in his white dual-cab ute. His dog was already in the back, and Thor was nearly snapping the chain I had him on to get to the ute. He knew what we were doing, and he was getting excited. After I loaded my stuff and we got on our way, I asked my mate where we were going. "The Paliga," he said. Now, for anyone who doesn't know or has not heard of the Paliga Forest, it's just outside of Narrabri, New South Wales. There have been so many Bigfoot stories about that place, even a movie made about it. There's a highway that runs through the middle of it. Big semi-trailer trucks can blow tires and the drivers won't even pull up to fix them. Everybody knows about the stories and the sightings down there. I didn't know it, but we were about to add to the tally. It was about a 2-hour drive from my home down to the Paliga Forest. You can tell when the forest starts because the red soil on the side of the road turns to an almost sand or fine gravel. We continued until we saw an opening in a rarely used car track, and we turned in there and continued on for about 15 minutes. My mate slowly pulled the ute up to a 5-wire fence at a T intersection and said, "This is it. Let's go." I asked him who owned the property. He just shrugged and giggled as he unchained his dog. He reached over to unchain Thor, but Thor's lips came up and his teeth came out. "Go on, he's only playing," I said. "Stop being a Flossie and unclip it." I laughed, but he uttered an expletive and walked away defeated. I unclipped Thor's chain, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and off we went through the fence. We found a goat track and followed it for about 10 minutes. It was pretty easy to walk through. The dogs were leading the way with their noses in the air, trying to scent some pigs. My mate's dog had a better nose than Thor's. It spun to the left, sniffed a few times, and then took off. My mate and I were doing our best to follow. Thor hadn't picked up any scent yet, so he stayed by my side, watching the other dog and waiting for the barking and pig squealing to begin. I crouched down next to him and put my arm around him, giving him encouragement. "Where's the pigs, boy? You listening? Where are they?" He was getting psyched up. Both of his ears were standing straight up and he was ready to go. My mate and his dog were gone for about 2 or 3 minutes, but at this point, I couldn't see or hear either of them, just the grasshoppers and a few birds chirping. I was still crouched down next to my dog and watching in the direction my mate and his dog went when I got an overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. I looked up and down the track, but I didn't see anything. I spun on the balls of my feet to look behind me into the scrub, but I didn't see anything there. The bush was so thick to see more than 30 meters anyway. I spun Thor around to look in that direction. He was hesitant, still trying to watch the way my mate and his dog went, and I said, "What's up here? What is it?" And something finally got his attention. He stared out into the scrub as the hairs on his back stood up, and he started to growl. Jackpot, I thought. We're on again. I stood up and pushed Thor in that direction. "Get him, boy," I shouted as he put his ears back, head down, and took off into the scrub 1,000,000 miles an hour. In 5 seconds, I couldn't see him. I was chasing after him as fast as I could, listening for a pig to squeal. I could still hear him barking, but it was getting farther and farther away. He was 50 meters ahead of me, I'd say. I was thinking, God, I hope they aren't much further. I hate running. Thor's barking stopped, and I stopped. I was waiting for a noise to tell me which way to run through the bush to get him. I waited, and I waited. Usually this happens pretty quick, and I kept waiting, and then I heard yelping. I had never in my life heard Thor yelp, not even when he was a puppy. He was yelping with every breath, and I could hear the yelps getting closer. Whatever was making him yelp, he was having no part of it and was heading back to me. I could see him coming through the bush faster than he went in, and he was still yelping. His tail was between his legs and cowering. He got back to my feet and pissed himself in fear. He was trying to hide behind me, looking back in the direction he'd just come. This scared the absolute life out of me. I pulled my rifle off my back and pressed it into my shoulder and waited for whatever was chasing my dog to show itself. I couldn't hear a thing except for Thor's whimpering. As I stood there staring into the scrub, a smell hit me. I thought Thor had lost control of his bowels and then rolled in burnt hair. I could hear my mate's dog barking behind us as they returned to the road that I was standing on. I could hear them a fair bit behind us, but I wasn't game to take my eyes off the scrub in front of me. His dog picked up our scent and they found us. My mate called out, "Did you get one or what?" And I shushed him. "Something ain't right," I said. He didn't even acknowledge what I said and started walking back to the road. I yelled out, "I'm going back to the ute and I'm leaving." He yelled over to me and said for me to stop being a baby. "No, mate, something's wrong." "I'm leaving," I told him. He knew I wasn't joking and he agreed. I walked backwards the entire trip back to the ute. My mate climbed through the fence and I passed him my gun so I could climb through. I insisted on driving. I just wanted to get out of there. We got packed up and started down the trail that he'd driven us in on. After about 2 minutes of driving in silence, both dogs on the back started barking and looking out the left side of the ute into the scrub. My mate said, "Hey, pull up. We'll let the dogs off." I quickly turned down his request and he said, "Pull over." Then he pulled the handbrake, stalling the ute. He pulled his gun up to his shoulder and looked through the scope into the scrub. The dogs were going ballistic now. I looked over and saw something about 40 meters out. My mate was trying to find this thing in his scope, waving it back and forth. He pushed the bolt forward and down, and he chambered a bullet, still looking for whatever it was in the scope. He must have had the magnification turned up a fair bit because he was struggling to find it. And then he gasped. I stared at him for a minute, waiting for an answer before nearly yelling, "What is it?" He uncocked the gun and said, "Mate, I think it's a bloke." He took his eye away from the scope and looked over the gun. Back to the scope and back over the gun. He cocked it again, aimed down below the tree, and then boom! The warning shot rang out as this thing spun around and ran off on 2 legs, just like you or I. The sound of this thing's feet hitting the ground and breaking off the branches as it ran still scares me. My mate turned to me and he said, "Yeah, fair call, let's go." I have never been back to this place. I never plan to go back by any means. Thanks for reading my story. Sorry for the spelling mistakes. I know I sound dyslexic. Brother, you aren't near as dyslexic as I am, but this was a great story because he's got this dog, this 200-pound dog or 96-kilogram dog that is just fearless, and it's a vicious dog. And this dog is scared to death of whatever that was. I'm almost sure that that thing got after his dog. I don't know. I could elaborate on this story for forever, but it's real exciting. It's another story from Australia, from our good friends in Australia. I've read a little bit about the Paliga Forest. I understand they've got some issues with fracking and gas extraction in that area. It's a beautiful, pristine wilderness, and I think industry is coming in and really giving the farmers trouble. And so anyway, if you're interested in that, look up the Paliga Forest in Australia and learn about it. It's an interesting story about that place. Okay, I'll quit rambling. Appreciate the email, buddy. Thank you. That's going to do it for this video. I'll be back soon. Within the next 2 days, we'll have another video up, probably a long one. And then at some point, probably by Monday, we're going to have another Steve Lilly installment. I'm just having so much fun doing this, and I'm so glad to be back doing it. I'm just happy. I'm a happy boy. I'm a happy boy. Cam's a happy boy. All right, you guys have a nice evening. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you.